So that's the basic picture of what the archaeological evidence seems to indicate about the Israeli region during the Stone Age. Around 2.5 million years ago, the seas dropped and the land bridge across the Red Sea opened up and became dry land, allowing the early hominids to leave Africa and populate the rest of the world. And then 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus came out of Africa, and around 250,000 years ago, there's evidence of Neanderthals in that region. And about 125,000 years ago, Homo sapiens crossed the Red Sea, and they say that migration wasn't really successful until about 60,000 years ago. And DNA evidence indicates that 70,000 years ago, a small group carrying the L3 gene crossed the Red Sea, giving rise to the variety of ethnic groups we see today. Then agriculture and farming developed, and around 3800 BC, the first Semites appeared in that region. And this right here is still talking about the prehistory of the southern Levant. It says the area's location at the center of 3 trade routes linking 3 continents made it the meeting place for religious and cultural influences from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor. And then it talks about how the amount of rainfall could have been a factor in determining the culture that developed there. And during the Bronze Age, around 2300 BC, there are references to a number of biblical sites, and the Middle Bronze Age after that is associated by some to be the arrival of Abraham's family. And it's also the period, according to this, in which Semites began to appear in Egypt. So when it says Semites, I'm assuming it's referring to the true definition of the word, the Middle Eastern ethnic groups. But the problem with some of these biblical events being attributed to certain time periods is that they have trouble finding the archaeological evidence proving the timing of these events. And we were looking last week at the contradiction in the Bible saying that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not know God by the name of Yehovah here in Exodus 6:3. Yet in the story of Abraham, Genesis uses the name Yehovah. So if Exodus 6:3 is correct in that Abraham did not use the name Yehovah, then Genesis 12's use of the word Yehovah, for example, must be wrong. So it seems the texts were altered, and Jeremiah 8:8 seems to indicate that when it says the pen of the scribes is in falsehood. And we know the texts were written during the phases of the beast as well, with the first mention of Yehovah occurring during the first phase of the beast. So if there are inconsistencies like that, then it's reasonable to question whether or not someone mixed ancient legend with the historical record of certain tribes in that region. For example, the legend of the parting of the Red Sea, which according to scientists actually happened back here when early hominids crossed over on dry land when the seas dropped, and also 70,000 years ago when Homo sapiens successfully crossed over. That legend of God's people crossing the Red Sea on dry land may have been mixed into the actual recorded history of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. And that wouldn't be surprising because we know many ancient cultures borrowed from ancient myths and attributed them to their own history. For example, the Romans attributed ancient myth to the history of their leaders. And we also know the book of Genesis contains stories from more ancient cultures. For example, the story of the Great Flood, which originated in Mesopotamia, that was ascribed to the history of the Israelites as well. So the true crossing of the Red Sea may refer to all of humanity, not just one subtribe. So archaeologists, anthropologists, and biologists generally agree that modern humans came out of Africa. And part of that can be represented by the DNA of the humans in those areas, and also the DNA of the fossils of those areas, I guess, with every group outside of Africa descending from the L3 that crossed the Red Sea 70,000 years ago. And that leads to the question of race. So according to Wikipedia, there's broad scientific agreement that typological conceptions of race are untenable. And there's a wide consensus that racial groups cannot be biologically defined. It says by the 1970s, a consensus developed among anthropologists and geneticists that race did not exist. The typological approach to race is generally regarded as discredited by biologists and anthropologists. The existence of adaptive human hereditary hereditary variation is not found in packages that can be labeled races. The phenotype-based descriptions of race, for example, those based on hair texture and skin color, ignore a host of other similarities and differences that do not correlate with the markers for race. And then it talks about a skin lightening mutation that partially accounts for the appearance of light skin in people who migrated out of Africa into Europe between 20,000 to 50,000 years ago. And then it says traits and gene frequencies do not always correspond to the same geographical location. It says anthropologists of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries discovered that the more traits and the more human groups they measured, the fewer discrete differences they observed among races. And eventually, anthropologists concluded that there were no discrete races at all. And recent genetic studies indicate that skin color may change radically over as few as 100 generations, or about 2,500 years. And then it says, and any two individuals from different populations are almost as likely to be more similar to each other than either is to a member of their own group. So it says here, more genetic variation exists within certain supposed races than among them. Again, most human genetic variation is found within populations, not between them. Individuals are frequently more similar to members of other populations than to members of their own population. And then it says race is a social concept, not a scientific one. There are no bright lines that would stand out if we could compare all the genomes of everyone on the planet. And it says full siblings can pertain to different racial groups, and only a few genes are responsible for someone's skin color and traits. A person who is considered white may have more African ancestry than a person who is considered black, and vice versa. The notion that human beings can be separated into biologically distinct races is generally rejected by the scientific community. And then it talks here about a survey taken in 1985 asking 1,200 American scientists how many disagree with the statement there are biological races within the species Homo sapiens. And 41% of physical anthropologists and 53% of cultural anthropologists disagreed with that statement, meaning they think biological races do not exist in the human species. And then in 1999, the same survey was conducted with 69% of physical anthropologists and 80% of cultural anthropologists saying they do not believe biological races exist in the human species. And then it says down here, the selective forces of climate are probably the primary forces of nature that have shaped skin color, hair texture, nose and cheekbone shape, etc. And this is basically saying right here that what we see with our eyes is not the most important component of a person's genetic disposition. It represents a small minority. And then it gives the example of skin color versus blood type. So for example, Europeans and Chinese are closer in skin color, while Europeans and Africans are closer in blood type. So there's so many different categories of DNA that how do you decide which one is more important than the other? You don't, is basically what they're saying. And, or at least it's not clearly defined in racial groups. So this is a quote right here from the American Anthropological Association, 1998. It says, "It has become clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups because, for one thing, quote, there is greater variation within racial groups than between them." So for example, right here it says physical phenotype is not related to genetic affinity. For example, dark-skinned Ethiopians are more closely related to light-skinned Armenians than to dark-skinned Bantu populations. So I guess although there are specific genetic markers, such as the haplogroups, that are associated with different ethnic groups, most of the scientists are now saying race does not exist. Only the geographical and cultural background of humans that constitutes which ethnic group they identify with. And they're saying that our appearance gradually changes to adapt to our environment over a long period of time. And the major differences that someone might perceive between themselves and someone of another ethnic group is only coincidence, because science shows that you will find more differences among the people you identify with your own ethnic group than between your group and another group. That's what the scientists are agreeing on now. So you're more likely to find someone that is exactly like you in a different ethnic group than the one you identify with, is what they found. And the physical phenotype, as they call it, which is the physical characteristics, that's defined by an extremely small percentage of the overall DNA and is correlated to a person's ancestral geographical background, which they believe changes drastically over a period of about 2,500 years. And then, of course, you have the cultural differences, which obviously is cultural. So the point is, most scientists agree that we all came out of Africa across the Red Sea and that races do not really exist. So it seems that the story of God's people refers to all Homo sapiens on the planet. And that explains why Revelation 7:9 says the rescue of God's people when the asteroid impacts will be of all tribes and nations. God does not favor one tribe over another and never has. All humans are African descendants and God's people. But there's one more thing. We all know Genesis 2 tells us the Lord God, which is Yehovah, planted a garden in Eden, and one of the rivers that came out of Eden was the Euphrates, and the Euphrates is in modern-day Iraq, which was ancient Mesopotamia, where the Bible tells us the beast empire originated. So science indicates Northeast Africa was the origin of modern humans, and the Bible indicates it was Mesopotamia. But we've talked about this in other videos. It does appear that there are two different gods in Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1, the name for God is Elohim, and it says Elohim created the whole earth and everything in it. But in Genesis 2, the name for God is Yehovah, and it says Yehovah created Eden and Adam and Eve. And because the Bible also tells us Yehovah is the beast, and the beast founded its empire in Mesopotamia, I wonder if Yehovah was involved with some type of genetic engineering of the human population that Elohim had already created. Because one of the curses upon the first woman, Eve, was childbirth pain. It says, in sorrow you will bring forth children. And as I was researching the prehistory of Israel, I came upon this, and I think this is actually under the section Homo sapiens in Wikipedia. It says, as a consequence of bipedalism, human females have narrower birth canals and childbirth is more difficult and dangerous than in most mammals, especially given the larger head size of human babies compared to other primates. Human fetuses are also born less developed and more vulnerable. And those are drawbacks that I find hard to believe were part of the natural order. And the book of Genesis mentions it as a curse as well. So I wonder if there were some genetic alterations or something done to early humans. And then it talks about the hairlessness of humans versus apes, and that reminded me of the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob, the smooth and hairless one, and Esau, the red and hairy hunter. So that could be another reference to the Neanderthal tribe from Europe that dominated modern humans coming out of Africa. Because the story of Jacob and Esau is that they were twins. Esau, the hairy one, came out first, and so was the firstborn. And that could represent the hominins that came out of Africa first, out of the womb of humanity, so to speak. And apparently they were definitely hairy, and scientists say they developed eventually into Neanderthals. And we talked about how they think the Neanderthals in Europe dominated the modern Homo sapiens that also came out of Africa. So the hairy one, the hominin Esau, came out first. Then the smooth one, the Homo sapiens, or Jacob, came out afterward. But remember, it was Jacob who stole Esau's birthright. The smooth Homo sapien took the place of the Neanderthals, and then Jacob, the Homo sapien, was renamed Israel. So the descendants of Jacob are the Homo sapiens. The 12 tribes of Israel are all of humanity on the planet right now. Again, it seems possible that part of these stories are much more ancient than we originally thought. And some researchers have theorized that the ancient Mesopotamian gods were actually real people who came from the skies and genetically engineered modern humans. So I have to start part 3 right here. The link is below.